Martial World Teyvat Chapter 61, Fantasy Fiction by Azazyel. A slight hiss was eked out of Jean Gunhildr, and her sister Barbara was giggling as she gently pulled the blanket off her sister. "Come now, Jean, normally I have to put you to bed with how you overwork yourself. But now after being bullied by a foreign god, you are sulking." Jean gave her sister a dull look before she grunted out. "Morax punched me through a mountain." "Not into a mountain, no, with several punches I was used as a drill to punch entirely through a mountain." Barbara's lips twitched as she tried not to react to her sister's very uncustomary whining, but Jean continued. "And when I get home to Mondstadt, all of the overpriced metal we bought at great expense is properly moved between the noble families, the troops, and some of the people paid back." Jean took a deep breath before her voice came back with heat. "And what are our gods doing? Barbados, Decarabian, Andreas, and Croanoa are all just drinking." Barbara smiled wryly and said helplessly, "Jean, when is Barbados not drinking? At least the drunken god isn't taking the form of notable women and doing weird things with slimes again." There was a pause as Jean's exhausted expression paled at the memory of the drunken wind god's whimsical idea to drunkenly play around in the form of cloud retainer in the nude. And in a massive pit filled with anemo slimes being used as a sort of supersized childish ball pit. Then of course the natural retribution that was the result of cloud retainer somehow learning that it happened and getting her revenge on the wind god and leader of Mondstadt's divine pantheon via destroying several valuable vineyards. "Do not speak of that, please, Barbara." Jean muttered with a sigh as she sat up with a hand going through her vibrant golden hair before she raised an eyebrow at her sister and spoke more firmly. "So, you wouldn't be in my house if you didn't need something specific. So what has happened?" Although Jean and Barbara both loved each other as sisters and respected one another's choices in life. With Jean being the leader of the Knights of Favonius, and Barbara is a high-ranking member of the clergy of Mondstadt's divine pantheon, with the worshippers feeding their faith energy to the gods of Mondstadt to make them stronger. They were still slightly estranged due to how Jean and Barbara's childhoods featured them being torn apart via a messy divorce that consisted of the mother taking Jean and making her a warrior as befitted the Gunhildr clan. And likewise, their father took Barbara, and being a high-ranking member of the clergy, Barbara followed in her father's footsteps in joining the Mondstadt church. So Barbara wouldn't just pop into Jean's house without forewarning, let alone break into her personal bedroom. Barbara, at hearing the firm question, lost her smile and she spoke quietly. "Inazuma was the one who kidnapped Jake after his wedding. Already the wind anemo spirits have been stirred up via the Raiden sisters' attempts to obscure it. I have already reported a massive building following Jake's minimalist style of massive structures being built in only a week." Jean absorbed that information before she snorted. "Those kitsune." Barbados whispered they were just clones during the wedding. They must have snatched him away while the other sects of Liyue made a mess with their own movements. With Barbara adding on, "And that's when you, Arlecchino and Yelan got into a fight with Morax beating you three up, right?" Jean gave her shameless sister who needed her own beating a dark look. But Barbara just smiled like a pretty innocent angel in response to the dark look. And then Jean carefully folded her hands together in front of herself as she pondered what use that information was. Should she send the news to Liyue to build goodwill? Should she make a play at kidnapping Jake as well by encouraging Croanoa, the goddess of time, to sneak him away? Or should she just ignore the news and remain neutral, as despite how amazing it would be to have Jake build a fabrication factory here in Mondstadt that exceeds or just matches the factory he made in Liyue? She knew that being the second person to kidnap Jake was going to be a true slap to the face of Liyue, who was assuredly going to perform some measure to take Jake back to Liyue. If it was Inazuma, they would have had Jake create some sort of production to mass-produce food, as that's Liyue's biggest issue due to their poor soil that's been tainted by rain that carries a bunch of salt in it due to abyssal monsters forcing violent rainstorms with water directly from the ocean. Jean mused to herself. She let her hands unfold as one hand went to her chin and the other arm rest under her prodigious bust as she continued thinking. "We don't get anything from blackmailing Inazuma, as it's assured that it will be but a few days at most till Liyue's adepti and Liyue Chixing find out." Jean looked to her sister and asked, "Has Barbados and any of the other divines said anything of their own will?" Barbara nodded and said quietly, They have been busy with the Eastern Abyss Gate, so they don't want to rock the boat too much and have actual conflict with either Liyue or Inazuma. So they want us to win something, but not cost us anything. Jean sniffed at their divine will and she couldn't help a wry chuckle as she muttered. How greedy of them. Well, I do have an idea in fact. The leader of the Knights of Favonius smiled with a cool chill in her eyes as she remarked. Alice was talking about Klee needed an interesting target to practice making her latest explosives. It would be quite interesting if such explosives found themselves at Jake's newest factory in Inazuma. There was a moment of silence before Barbara said slowly. That is the very definition of making enemies in Inazuma, sister. To which Jean shrugged and said calmly. Oh, not that Klee's bombs would be used to destroy said factory. More like maybe destroy its backyard to get everyone's attention and meanwhile Jake can be snatched away or be able to flee on his own. Barbara considered the scenario and then asked slowly. And what do we gain from this? I don't see it, Jean. Jean gave a slight hum as she stood up from her bed and then she tied her long blonde hair behind her head in its signature ponytail before she said firmly. It certainly won't endear us to Inazuma. But frankly, getting involved in general will not endear us to Inazuma. No, the goal is to get a piece of Jake's genius in return for our aid. Better trade deals, a factory of our own, maybe even manage to invite him here for the Windbloom Festival. There was a silence before Jean gave Barabara an almost smug smile and said. Maybe you will get another chance to work your wiles on him again. And more importantly, find out more of his information, if he didn't recognize you, myself, others, and know stuff only someone from Mondstadt would know, I would think he was lying about his past. That was by far the biggest pet peeve niggling at Jean's mind at least once or twice a day. How in the hell did Mondstadt manage to suppress Jake to the point where he, a normal mortal without martial arts or any cultivation, decided to flee and run all the way to Liyue? And spies in the Liyue harbor's guards and merchants collaborated the story with the merchants of the Li family, happily telling the spies about how they picked up Jake on the side of the road and took him into the city. Honestly, it was the most infuriating thing. Is Lisa at the library currently? I need to speak with her as well. Jean asked her sister, who shrugged helplessly. I have no idea, Jean. I have been busy, as you well know, though Lisa isn't exactly a very active person, so it's likely that's the case. With that confirmation made, Jean waved her hand at Barbara and said with a wry smile. All right, Barbara, thank you for the news, but excuse me, I need to get changed and get to work. A soft clinking noise rang out as Ningguang tapped her metal-tipped fingernails on a jade tablet that contained a recording of Jake working over several menial workers who were forced to stand there like fools as he built up another factory of his. The Heavenly Mountain sect, and the Cloud Refining sect will be getting copies of this obviously. Ningguang's lips twitched in cruel amusement as she muttered. What, did they expect to hide a several-mile-wide massive factory under some strong illusions, kill a bunch of commoners who worked on it and try to sell the information and nothing come of it? The merchant queen of Liyue sniffed at the arrogance of the Inazuma gods, and especially the smug kitsune who in hindsight obviously got off to the thought that with their clones being here, they got away with kidnapping Jake and Kaching to Inazuma. Beyond kidnapping Jake to Inazuma when he had his own responsibility here and Liyue's people wanted his amazing technology for their own further enhancing prosperity, there was the fact that in kidnapping Kaching, Inazuma literally basically kidnapped the underminister of Liyue Harbor's militant arm of the Millilith. And that insult alone was going to lead to blood being spilled between Inazuma and Liyue. But also due to it being done obviously at the behest of Inazuma's gods themselves, that meant that Liyue's gods were going to get involved. Ningguang's hand squeezed the jade recording stone with her mental energy, copying the memory to another jade recording stone, and then she took out a couple of messaging seals and slipped the recording stones into them. Then the messaging seals glowed with golden light before taking on the form of a slightly glowing sparrow that flew out of the jade chamber's balcony Ningguang was working within.